Assalamu alaikum. So everyone could please come a little bit closer, inshallah, so I don't have to raise my voice so much. So alhamdulillah, today we will conclude from the last two series of this whole series about how Islam came into South Asia and how it spread and how it was maintained. So the topic of the talk, the subject matter is about taking the narrative back. And as I've said before, we have been taught a history that has truth and lies in it. Because our land was colonized, and when the colonizer, at the end, when the colonizer, whilst colonizing and in that colonial period, most when the colonizer left, made sure that they kind of distorted our history. History is so important to us that through history we identify ourselves. Through history we track our lineage. We can say who we are, where we're from. But when that's been distorted, you can create a new identity, a false identity. So we'll look into that today, inshallah. Last week I went through with a bit more detail about the Mughal family, the house of Timur, and we talked a little bit about Aurangzeb. There was a lot more to cover, but I just went briefly about his success and how he managed to rule the vast land that he did. But today we'll look into, inshallah, something that may seem not so relevant, but it is very relevant. We'll look into Spain today and what happened in Spain with the Muslims and how that in turn changed the history or changed the events that unfolded, and it led to where we are today. So as we all know probably, that Spain, or most of Spain, or all of Spain, was ruled by Muslims up to about, say, 1000 AD. Talking about 1,000 years ago from now on, 1000 AD. From 711 to the end of 900s, the Muslims ruled more or less all of Spain. And at that time, what happened was, the Umayyad dynasty that ruled Spain, it ended. And when it ended, smaller little kingdoms came about in Spain. And this is the time when the Crusaders also make an attack to the Holy Land. And the first attempt was a very, very poor fail, like it's a miserably failed attempt. On the second one, it's known as the First Crusade still, but they succeed. What these Crusaders do, instead of just going directly from, say, France and Germany through Italy and coming to Jerusalem, a lot of them go through Spain as well. And instead of coming to Jerusalem, they settle in Spain because the Pope gives them the idea that we have to get rid of the Muslims from Spain as well. So when the Umayyad dynasty falls, there's the whole Spanish Islamic empire is shattered. And eventually it takes them almost 400 years to take over all of Spain, because the Muslims do resist, and that's another topic altogether. So exactly on 1492, on 2nd of January, when Queen Isabel and Ferdinand, because even the Catholics, they're quite divided, they joined through a marriage, and they take over what was known as Granada, or the Kingdom of Granada, from Abu Abdullah. He was the last. He hands over the key. And from then, what you have is the establishment of the idea of Europe. What we know today as Europe, it didn't always exist like this understanding, this continent of Europe as such. If you go back to the Greco-Roman times, the Greeks and the Romans ruled, they were a different people. They were Mediterranean people. They did not associate themselves with the Germanic and the Celtic people of Northern Europe. Like today is Germany, France, Britain. This was known as the people of Celt or Germanic people. And the Romans and the Greeks saw these people of the north. So if you can imagine, sorry, I don't have a map, but if you can imagine Europe, where Italy is divided by the Italian Alps, the mountains. You have the Swiss Alps, the Alps mountain, segregates Italy from like Switzerland, Austria, and France, and so forth. So the Italian people are a different people from the Germanic people. So when the Romans ruled or the Greeks ruled, they always saw the Germanic people as a very barbaric kind of people, uncivilized. So when the Romans even came up to Britain and they ruled Britain, they tried to civilize these people. They had a very hard time. So that's why you have Roman roads and some Roman architecture left. Because Romans are quite civilized actually. But these people, the Celts of the British Isles and the Germanic people, are very, very uncivilized. However, when they take over Spain completely in 1492, they see and they learn from the Muslim civilization that's left. It takes them a long time. So from the 1100s all the way up to 1492, the learning about civilization, about how to administer, about how to run a government, how to, basically like set up running water, like plumbing. They're learning basic plumbing. They didn't have basic plumbing in Europe. You throw their waste out the window. There'll be like human waste everywhere. They're very, very unclean, very unhygienic people. I mean, it was so bad that when they do take over Spain, and because the Spanish people, the Muslims, because obviously when Muslims are clean, we have to, shower regular, especially on a Friday. But the Christians are not like this. So on Fridays, they passed a law that Muslims can't have a bath. Muslims are not allowed to shower. And it's called the Spanish Inquisition. They would send inspectors, like police, inside the house to make sure that Muslims didn't shower on a Friday. Because so many of these people, they pretended to be Christians, but they were actually Muslims. So they made houses like that so they could do their, Juma namaz and things like this inside the house. But anyhow, from 1492, what happens, the idea of Europe and white supremacy is kind of born. Like, we are a European people and they are the other, and now we have to come up with a way how we can make ourselves superior to the Muslims. Because until then, Muslims ruled everywhere. Muslims are feared. Even at that time, Muslims are feared very much, because it was 1453 when Constantinople, Istanbul, that was taken over by Muhammad Fatih, Muhammad the Conqueror they called. And they were very, very scared that he's going to come into Spain and help the Muslims. So what they first did, they oppressed the Jews, and they forcefully converted the Jews into Christianity, and these Jews were called conversos. But after they take over all of Spain, and after some time, what they do, they start expelling the Muslims as well. And it takes about another 100 years. We come into the 1600s. And this is when Christopher Columbus has already gone to the Americas, and he's gone to other places. The Portuguese and the Spanish, they're going around the world now. They're discovering the new world. It's called the Age of Discovery. And wherever they're going, the Portuguese and the Spanish, they are spreading Christianity. They're not really looking for trade. They're looking for gold and silver and things like that. But they're actually spreading Christianity. So that's why in Goa today, you have a very huge Catholic population in west of India, because that's where the Portuguese first came and settled. But at the same time, that's when Babur is coming into India and establishing his kingdom as well. And around that time, what happens, you have, let me get the dates right this time. So it's around exactly the 1600s. This is when Queen Elizabeth is ruling England, and she hates the Catholics. Because what the Spanish do, they take over a lot of Europe as well. Because it's like, the Roman Empire became three Roman empires. You have the Holy Roman Empire, the Latin Roman Empire, which is today's Rome. You had the Eastern Roman Empire. That was Constantinople or Istanbul, which fell to the Muslims. There's two Roman empires left, and the Spanish, they continue with this Roman Empire. And so places like Holland and other parts, they're under the Spanish rule, and they're trying to invade England as well. And Queen Elizabeth hates the Catholic, and she's seeking alliance. However, this guy called Thomas Smythe from central London, the city of London, he sets out, heard about the Dutch, the people from Holland are, they're going to the East Indies, Indonesian island and India, and they're bringing a lot of wealth, they're trading. And this is when the stock market or the stock exchange starts. And this is when they go, and instead of actually, trading, they rob the Portuguese ship, and they bring back £1 million from that time. So imagine £1 million 400 or 500 years ago, 400 years ago, it's like £1 billion today or more. So this made a lot of people very, very rich, and they continued onwards. So but the English were very, very far behind, unlike the Spanish or the Dutch. They were actually lacking behind, and they were looking very rough. And it takes them up to about, from 1600s, we come up to about 1618, when Jahangir is in power, the Mughal Badshah. He finally gives the Thomas Roe, the ambassador sent under King James, the license to trade. So they build the first factory, meaning just a warehouse, and they're allowed now to come and set up their business, and they can start trading. Now, as from the Roman times, silver and gold has always been pouring into India because of spices, especially peppers and other things like that. And this continues. And what's really interesting, why Spain is so involved here, because Spain and Portugal, they take over South America quite rapidly, and North America, because these people are not as advanced in the technology, and they find a lot of gold and silver. So they bring in a lot of gold and silver from the New World, which is South America. They bring it into Europe. And what the English are doing, they're robbing these ships, and that's how they get in a lot of this silver. The pirates, the real pirates actually were the English to start off with. It wasn't the Portuguese or the Spanish. They were robbing the other European counterparts. And with this money, they were trading into India, buying stuff and selling and so forth. As time goes by, slowly they're growing. You know, the powers come in, and they're learning how to administer, how to run a system. They learn what they call an art of imperialism. How you, as the other, a foreign person, how you can rule you being a minority, but how you can rule the majority. Because that's what the Muslims were a minority in India all along. Even now, and even back then, they were a minority, but they happen to rule the majority Hindu subjects. And how do they do this? So this is what the English are learning from them, you know, how to subjugate a people. And as their power grows, I'm going to fast forward to another 100 years, well into like the late 1600s now. There's a guy called by something of Child. What happens is Aurangzeb, he sends, because he couldn't go to Hajj himself, so every year during the Hajj season, he would send lots of gifts, you know, to the Haramain, to Makkah, Medina, because he couldn't go out. Respect what the sultans did, that was quite common. And one of his ships get robbed. When the ship gets robbed, they say equivalent to today's £30 million worth of goods that got robbed by an English pirate. So what Aurangzeb does is, like, he expels the English. He says, you cannot trade in my land anymore. And because the French were also competing for this, out of like to make fun of the English, they made a portrait of the English, ambassadors doing, like, bowing down to Aurangzeb, pleading that we will compensate wherever the loss was. Please let us trade with you. So French did a drawing. The famous drawing is around still. So this is the kind of power the Muslims had at the time. And what Aurangzeb and many others did, they would use the Portuguese against the Spanish, the French against the English and the Dutch, and they would play against one another, you know, and these guys would be fighting with one another most of the time. So they didn't have the time, energy, even the thought to take over India itself. Also, because of the Reformation that was taking place in Europe, because Europe was coming out of Catholicism, so they were fighting. There was known as the famous 30-year war. So the Protestant Christians and the Catholics were fighting to heavy fighting. And it wasn't just a 30-year war. They continued fighting all the time. And because of their constant fighting, they developed, like, their guns, their cannons and things like this. So they're advancing. Whereas from the peak of the Turks, when the cannon came out and things like that, they did improve on the artillery, but not so much. They was not advancing as much. But the Europeans were. And when Aurangzeb dies, unfortunately, what happens, unlike himself, none of his son or his grandchildren are as competent. And there's a reason for that as well. Because Aurangzeb himself, when he was young and his other counterparts, they were always out in the field. But his children, they were not out in the battlefield as much. So they were very, very palace grown. So they didn't have the understanding or the intellect of warfare. You know, so they fought with one another and they lose a lot of ground, and the empire almost falling out. And at the same time, you have this guy called Nadir Shah who comes from Iran, and he buys this advanced weaponry from I think one of the European powers, where he puts like a tripod like this, puts it on a horseback, and it's like a swivel gun, and the gun you can maneuver in different places. Until then, they did have muskets, but the problem with the muskets was that you load, you shoot, and then you have to load again. There's a lot of smoke. It's a very, very slow process. It was not sufficient. But this gun was like today's kind of machine gun. You put it on the horseback. Anyway, he comes with this artillery on the horsebacks, loaded, and he defeats the Mughals. And what he does, he takes all their jewelry. If I'm mistaken, something like 8,000, boxes of jewelry or something he takes. And from there he takes the famous Kohinoor that's in the Tower of London now. So Nadir Shah is the first to rob the Kohinoor from the Mughals. That's another story in itself. Anyhow, and he takes the Peacock Throne. The Peacock Throne was Shah Jahan's throne that he built, which apparently, I don't understand, but it cost more than the Taj Mahal itself. It's a throne maybe size of this wall, but it costs more than the Taj Mahal itself. And it's actually kept in a house in Wales, in a mansion there. And a lot of the best of the Mughal kind of jewelry, the swords, many, many other things are kept in this mansion in Wales. Now it's still there on display. Some of it is in the Royal Albert Hall, Victorian Albert Hall in South Kensington, some of it. But most of it is still, especially the Peacock Throne is still there, as far as I know anyway. He takes that away. And with all that jewelry, all that wealth was like the way the Mughals financed their soldiers, their army. And what happens, because the French and the British are competing now, big time, they're fighting with one another, they also, because of the advanced weaponry, the warfare tactic changes. Until then, it was like men on a horse, and they had a system that worked. But what happens with this new style is that they have this kind of square kind of, like few hundred men in a square grid. They move, like the front row will sit, the rear row will stand and shoot, and then while these guys load up the gun, the others will stand up and shoot. Because they came up with this kind of gas, I can't remember, that alleviates the smoke leaving from the barrel. And the Indians, or the Muslims, or Hindus, wherever, the native people don't have access to this. And they're advancing. So what happens is now, because they're getting richer and the Mughal doesn't have the treasury to finance the soldiers, so the English company, as well as the French company, they are recruiting. Because people are poor, people need to, need a wage, need a way of life. Everyone needs a salary. So they're being recruited into these British and the French company. And there's a man that comes along by the name of Hyder Ali. He was under one of the Hindu kings in the south, and he learns this. He learns what's going on here, and he picks it up, the new war formation and the new technology that they have. And he takes over he overthrows his Hindu king when he dies. He takes over the place, and he has a son, but everyone knows, I'm sure you heard of Tipu Sultan. So what Hyder Ali does, he learns his formation, and he does a better job than the British, and he challenges the British. And almost when the British seem so invincible, like no one can defeat them, Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan, they both together, with the assistance of the French, defeat the British, the English company, you could say. They absolutely annihilate them, how they plan things out. But what happens later on is Hyder Ali passes away anyway. As time goes by, the Nizam, which was part of the Mughal territory, they break away, the Nizam of Hyderabad. And the Marathas are growing, a very strong kind of Hindu-Muslim alliance, but mainly Hindu. They're growing, and they're kind of pillaging the Nizams, they're pillaging the Mughal areas as well. And you have the Nizam recruiting the British as mercenary to protect from the Marathas. Now these Marathas are advancing, but the Nizam, because they become so, the Mughals, the Nizams, the Muslims become so comfortable in their way, in their palace, living life of luxury, smoking hookah, having Nach girls and stuff like that. They're not living a rigid life like their predecessors. Even though Akbar and Jahangir and these guys however corrupt they may be, but they were always out and about, you know, doing stuff, hunting, keeping themselves on the edge, you know, not resting. But these guys became lethargic, relaxed. And that's why the empire was like, you know, slowly fading away from them. And obviously the British, the English, the French, they're coming in hungry, you know, because this place was, you know, all this bow and all these areas, this is all full of forest. There was nothing here. If you go to City of London, the actual City of London is a very small place. And most of all of this, that's why you have all these names like this green and that green. This is all green fields and forests. It's just all full of woods. Going back even 200 years ago, this is when all of this starts developing. So these people are going over there. These are men that are going over from England. They're absolutely knowing that the chance of them dying is like 1 to 100. There's a good chance that they're going to die. They're not going to even make it back. Just like how, imagine today, or even say 30, 40 years ago, how our fathers, or even now, people are still migrating into the country. Like they make jokes about people coming, you know, on a dinghy boats. Everyone's dying to come to England. Literally, that was the case, say up to 200 years ago, how the Europeans, the English, particularly, were dying to go to India, you know, and the journey, like I said last time, they couldn't go through the Suez Canal that you have today through Egypt. They had to go all the way around Africa to get to India because the Ottomans ruled that space and they just couldn't penetrate through. So they had to go all the way around. So it's much of a perilous journey than it is today. And literally, there were young men that were going, and a lot of them died out of cholera because they weren't made for that kind of climate and things like this. So as the whole point of this narrative back, taking the narrative back, is today in the media and everywhere is shown like, you know, everyone is just coming down to India, come to England, as if the English never did the same thing, as if the Europeans never did the same thing. But literally, up to 200 years ago, they was doing this, dying to go over there. But what happens is, as their power grows, and it's really when the Muslims or the native people are not advancing, they think, you know, we're okay, and they start hiring these Europeans. You know, they say you don't bite the hand that feeds you. That's what exactly happened. They were recruiting these people to protect themselves, and they're the very people that turned against them in the end, you know, because they knew you don't have any power. You know, they realized without us, you cannot be protected from your own people even. You know, there's all these small principalities, kingdoms, and that came about. So what happens with the joint force of Nizam and the British, they eventually defeat Tipu Sultan. So when Tipu Sultan's out the way, you have in Bengal, they move Siraj-ud-Dawla out the way, who kind of resisted them. And you have the last kind of resistance from the Mughal is called Badshah Alam. Shah Alam II, he was known as. And he puts up a resistance. He gets a whole lot of people together, and they have a famous battle known as the Battle of Buxar. And this is when Robert Clive was sent, actually, because they thought the French are going to take over India, so they need to send a huge army. But when they go to India, they realize that the French are not even there, you know, at a place called today's Mysore, or Chennai. I think they call it Chennai now. The French don't happen to be there. And what happened at that same time, Siraj-ud-Dawla, he defeats the English company in Calcutta, and, you know, he kicks them out. So in revenge, they retaliate to Siraj-ud-Dawla. But what happened was, Robert Clive wasn't really interested in settling there. He wanted to move on. But it was the Jagat Seth bankers who play the biggest part in all of this. They were Hindu bankers, and what they did was, it's kind of complicated. You have to be an economist to understand these things. Because India is huge, and the largest contributor to the economy of India, or the Mughal Empire, was Bengal. So all the revenue was coming from Bengal, and how do you shift all that money from Bengal to Delhi? So they had a kind of stock exchange kind of thing going on, and the Jagat Seth were in charge of this, and they became very rich. It's like the Rothschilds in Europe. So they became very rich, and what they did, it was them who actually invited Alverdi Khan, who was the grandfather of Siraj-ud-Dawla, to break away from the Mughals as well as resist the Marathas. But anyhow, it was them who invite Robert Clive, because they don't like Siraj-ud-Dawla, to come and defeat him, and they put Mir Jafar in his place. And when Mir Jafar, you know, when he's put in in Sirajuddaulah's place. He's just a puppet. Basically, the English are ruling from there on, and from then on, they go and they attack. Or they have the decisive battle of Buxar, where Shah Alam actually manages to get a whole lot of people to back him, and he has the French as well to support him. But the English win. The English company wins, and it was at that time when Shah Alam signs the Diwan. So the English company has been given the right now to tax the people of Bengal, Orissa and Bihar. And that changes everything. So first we have Nadir Shah, who comes and loots everything from the Mongol treasury. And now whatever revenue that they could produce from their land has been given away to the English company because they lost the battle. So they signed the Diwan and the English. And from that moment onwards, what happens is you have more and more, in hundreds of thousands, from England going over there, young men in their 20s, mid-20s or late 20s, in their 30s, doing what they like. And the policy that they come up with is that they make the people work, they don't barely pay them, they tax them on their own work, they take the raw material and they transfer it to England. And this is when in England you have all these, if you go to especially north of England, I mean, even where I grew up around Shoreditch, there used to be lots of factories. And these factories were being built there. Because until then, Bengal itself produced most of the cotton in the world, to such a point that the cotton industry in Mexico was getting bankrupt. That's the amount of material, like clothing, like Bengali silk. People don't talk about it. That was the most famous silk at the time. Bengali muslin was very, very famous. And Shutir Khafarjanamlar point, that was very, very famous. And Bengal was very, very, it was the mass producer of this. And it's like in every village you had these looms, producing this. So the British come and take over. Now what they do, instead of having the factories being made in Bangladesh or Bengal, they transfer the raw material to England. Now everything's being made in England and then sold back to all over the world, including Bengal. So it's like me coming, taking your stuff and then selling it back to you. Mm-hmm. That's what they exactly did. And Bengal, so at the peak of Aurangzeb's time, towards, say like in his age of 60, if you understand how GDP works, 40% of the GDP came out from Mughal India. When he died in 1707, it still had 24% of the world's GDP. Whereas in England, the GDP was only 3%. But by the end of British rule in 1947, it's turned the other way around. Whole of India is only producing 3% of the world's GDP. So what the other fascinating thing is when they come and they're looting and pillaging, but a lot of them, they adopt the Indian culture, especially the Muslim culture. They start dressing like Muslims. A lot of them do convert to Islam as well. And, they live in that kind of lifestyle. And then what happens, you have this Anglican Reformation going on, where the priests are coming and priests and reverends, and, they have all these different hierarchies in the church. They're coming over to India now and preaching the Bible, the gospel. And what they do, they're not happy with the East India Company because they're assimilating. They're becoming like the Indians themselves. Some are becoming Hindu, some are becoming Muslim. And so more missionaries come, and it's like, they're giving dawah to their own people now. Let's get these lot back into Christianity. And not only do they do that, they start spreading Christianity amongst the native people as well. And what's even shocking to me, what I found just the other day I was reading, is that even when the Portuguese and the Spanish, first when they came, and they came with a missionary purpose, that's why their empire didn't really expand or do so well. Whereas the English first came for loot, for money, to trade. And that's why they expanded, because they didn't feel like a threat to anyone. These people come to trade. Someone comes to do business with you, you're not going to feel a threat. But if someone comes knocking on your door with a Bible, you're going to feel a threat quite clearly, So by that time, the English were already well established, and you have these missionaries now coming, and when the preaching verbally didn't work, they were forcing people to become Christians as well. And on record it shows there was more, the Christianity spread far more during the time of the East India Company and British rule than it did during the time of the Portuguese and the Spanish, even when you take in Goa and the Western Ghats and these areas. But you have the ulama now coming to rise. You know, the ulama are very, very conscious of what's going on, especially the most famous alim of his time, known as Shah Wali Allah Dehlavi. His real name was Kutubuddin, and his father was Abdul Rahim, who actually was part of the compilation of Fatwa al-Amgir that set up by Aurangzeb. So Shah Wali Allah is very conscious of what's going on, and his son Shah Abdul Aziz is active about this as well. You know, these missionaries are going around and they're challenging the ulama, they're having open debates, and the people are becoming poor, like really, really poor, so destitute, so poor, they don't know what to do, and only option the common man has to do is join the English army, you know, this private company. That's the only option, because everyone needs to eat. You know, you have to eat. When hunger hits, you don't care about anything. Your manners, your everything. People sold themselves. People sold their children out of hunger. And we know this is happening in history. Just to give you, like, today, obviously we know what happened during, you know, Hitler's time. 6 million people got killed, which is absolutely wrong. But during Queen Victoria's rule in India, just to add, more than 30 million people died, and most of them out of starvation. At least more than 1 million people died out of hunger. You know, a lot of them died because they got, you know, they died in wars and stuff like that. But anyway, I'll come back to this in a minute. So people are, you know, they're recruited into the army. They have no choice. And what happens now, this is a rumor till this day, no one knows for a fact. So you know the cartridges that you have to put in your gun, you have to put some kind of fat in it. So apparently what was happening, out of despise, what the newcomers, what they were doing, they were filling it with either pork fat or beef fat. So obviously for the Hindus, beef fat is you know, very, very offensive to them. For us Muslims, pork fat is very offensive. And one of the things you have to do, you have to bite it with your teeth, and then put it into the gun and shoot. So the Sipayo, or the Sipo as they call them, the soldiers, they rebelled because of this. And when they rebel, and by that time the Mughals have no power. Their power, if anyone's been to Delhi, it's just you've been, yeah. So around the Red Fort is that's all their power. But symbolically, everyone still respects them. People still acknowledge them as the king. Even when the Sikhs come and take over, the Sikhs couldn't rule from the Red Fort. When the Marathas come and take over, they couldn't rule from the Red Fort. Even when the Durrani Afghans come, they couldn't rule, because no one just shows that respect to anyone like they do to the Mongols. You know, this lineage is still very, very symbolically respected. But however, their power is only as far as the four walls of the Red Fort goes. And what happens, these soldiers, so they rebel and they come and attack his fort. Now he's the last in the lineage now, Badshah Zafar, you know, who's left, the 20th Mughal emperor. And he's under pressure now to stand up against the British, and he eventually takes this on. But unfortunately, he loses to the British, you know, because of, you know, he wasn't a warrior, he was an old man as well. He didn't have any serious connections or anything like that. And it was by a stroke of luck as well. Luck just wasn't with them. And in 1857, what they call mutiny, the historians call the Battle of Mutiny, is when the actual lineage Mughal rule is completely over. So the British officially take over, and what happens is they exile Badshah Zafar to Burma. It's a long story how they take him there. They take him there, and he lives, I think, for another 4 or 5 years, and he dies in Burma, in Rangoon, in the capital. And as soon as he dies, they bury him. And they're so horrible. When they bury him, they fill it with lime juice and lemon juice, so that his body dissolves quickly to the earth. So no one, if anyone come and ever dug it up, there's no mark, there's no sign left of him. You know, they make sure this happens. And his sons and that, they execute them, they kill them. He has young sons as well. It's basically the dynasty is finished. All the way from Timur, from the late 1400s up to 1857. That's like more than what? Almost like 400 years of dynasty, one family, finished by the British. Now what happens, Parliament gets involved in England, and Queen Victoria, the government, the royal family takes over the English company. So India becomes part of the British Empire now, officially. Until then, until 1857, it was under the East India Company, nominally ruling. But when Queen Victoria takes over, every other historian makes it out like things got better for the Indian, but it actually didn't. Officially, it looked like it got better because so many of the people now got recruited into the government service because British are the government now, and they make Calcutta the capital for a short while, and then they make New Delhi the capital again. But during that time, what happens is there's more rice, more everything is being taken out of India into Britain and all over the world. And fast forwarding, so this is when India has become very poor now. And this idea, what these so-called missionaries and these other intellects, what they do, they create this consciousness of Hinduism. Until then, there was no understanding Hinduism as one collective religion. Prior to this, they had different religions within the religion. So some were Shivastis, some were Vaishnavites, some were Brahmins, and they had all these kind of different sects, and they were all fighting with one another the whole time, especially pre-Islamic times. This idea of unification, unified Hindu idea is actually taking place now. You know, this establishment. And they put this seed in that the Hindus are a majority and they should rule. So when they defeat, going back to Tipu Sultan, they don't give it in the hands of his relative or another Muslim. They give that principality to a Hindu, saying that, well, Hindus are the original, the natives of this land, so they should be ruling the place, not a Muslim. And that's what they do. So from my understanding, this was all systematically planned, that we have to remove Muslim rule from India. If we don't do that, they will rise again. Also, now what happens, obviously, the Muslims don't have any power. This idea of a Muslim land separate, a separate Muslim land is coming about. So 1857, they take over. In 1867, you have some of the ulama that who were engaged in this battle against the English. They establish a small madrasa known as Darul Ulum. So you had Muhammad Qasim from Nanatawi, and you had Rashid Ahmed, and many others. Gangohi, yeah, Rashid Ahmed from Gangoh. They were actually participants in this battle, in this war of mutiny in 1857. And obviously, after they're losing, they're wanted. There are men that they are under arrest now. However, they realize that we cannot fight them with firepower, so we have to preserve our deen, and we have to change how we teach. Until then, what you had was known as Farangi Mahal, what at the time of Aurangzeb, or even going further back. So a student will learn from a teacher, and you learn say you learn hifz from one person, you learn something from another person. It was like this. It wasn't a systematic teaching like what you had in the time of the Seljuks, the Nizamiya, where they had a very, very organized setup. And what Muhammad Qasim and others, what they saw, because they saw the British model of teaching, because some of them did serve in the British government as well, they thought we need to implement this systemized way of teaching. So they started with Mahmud al-Hassan, being the first student. And the first teacher's name was Mahmud, student name was Mahmud, and it was a blessing start, really. And it kind of really takes on very quick, and they don't have any government sponsorship, or it was a very kind of different model. It's very new for its time. And these people continue to resist, And also the other fascinating thing was that they were the students of Shah Abdulaziz direct. And Shah Abdulaziz wrote a book, how to argue or how to have a dialogue with the missionaries. And this one of the copies was discovered, I should say, by Ahmed Didat in South Africa. Yeah. He was in his back of his shop, or his dad's shop. He was going through the books, and he found this book. He opened this book and he read it. And this is what actually inspired Ahmed Didat to go out there and debate the Christian pastors and the reverends, and we all know how amazing he was. He was the dawn of his time. No one could touch him. He just annihilated everyone, And today, mashallah, from him we have many others today as well. But it was these ulama that made this constant effort to preserve our deen. But we have to ask ourselves this question: why did this come to us? And because at the end of the day, everything happens from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala take this glory away from us? One of the things, there's many reasons for this. One thing to look at is when we, the Muslim, the Ummah Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when we stop doing what we're meant to do as Ummah Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, specifically to do the work of da'wah, this will come back. This will hit you back. And the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has set this dunya, He's in His hukum, that you constantly have to advance. You have to either go forward. If you don't go forward, you're going to go backwards. There's no such thing as, okay, this is enough, I'll sit. If you set up a business, if you don't continue to increase your business is going to start falling back at some point. All these corporates you see, you have to constantly move forward. If you don't, you're going to go back. From the time of Aurangzeb, there was just no more advancing. Yeah, they became complicit. They became relaxed. They forgot the purpose. He, rahmatullahi, and the ones before him, they continued with the effort. The moment you stop making this effort, it will backfire you. That's what the Marathas did. The whole empire broke out. Foreigners come and ruling you, and this is what happened. So these ulama were making effort, and then you had at the same time Maulana Ilyas was coming out with something. Even though ulama of the Deoband were kind of against him at the time, like, what you're doing, what's this new innovation? Because he could see Muslims as slipping away. They're adopting Hindu names. They're adopting Hindu practices openly. Like, some effort has to be made. So we need to go back to our fellow Muslims first. Get everyone back to Deen, teach Iman. And also he made this famous dua. Well, to me, it's a special dua, that may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spread the risk of Muslims all over the world. Reading colonial history is like the saddest thing I could ever read about, because I'm originally from there and I've faced so much racism. The racism I faced is nothing compared to racism what our great-grandparents faced in their own country. So what you see happening in Palestine and places like that, that was actually happening in Hindustan all along. Muslims in their own homeland couldn't practice their religion openly, sadly. So the racism that we face is nothing compared to what they faced. But they resisted and they held on to their deen. And that's what we have to do as well. And if it wasn't for, the point I was about to make, as sad as this colonial period is, there's one good thing that came out of it. Because if these Europeans never went and colonized our lands, I don't think our parents would have never left Bangladesh or Pakistan or India. No one would have left. They no way would have come here. Because firstly, there was nothing to offer in here. And secondly, why would they come here from everything that they had? The food, it wasn't easy. But because the risk that they had was taken from them, brought here. And this risk brought them here. So alhamdulillah, because of all of that happened, today we're here. We have this beautiful masjid in Bo and all across the hamlets, all across the country. So what we have to do now, we have to continue with this, making this effort. We must not become lax. We must not think like, oh, it's okay now, we've done it. We're right, oh, this is good. And, take a seat back or take the back seat. We have to constantly move forward. Our generation, the next generation, continue. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not protect us otherwise. We need His protection. And that's the whole point of learning about history, is where did the Muslims go wrong? If you look in Islamic history, from the time Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam set out, and it was a continuous advancement. And then you had the first blockage when the Crusaders come and take over Spain. What happened? Not Spain, Jerusalem. That was the first real downfall of the Muslims. What happened then? Muslims, the Abbasid Khilafat fell. They became relaxed. You had the Crusaders, and then you had the Mongol onslaught. Yeah? And during that time, it was the Turks that came into rise, because the Arabs took the back seat. And in the West, you have the Berbers who went and saved Spain from Christian onslaught and saved for another few hundred years. Inshallah, we'll talk about Spain another time. That was the first real setback for the Muslims during the launch of the first crusade and Genghis Khan's first wave of onslaught. And then Salahuddin, we know, he comes, he saves and so forth. And then we have another real setback is during the First World War. This is when the Europeans completely dominate the world. They take over the Ottoman Empire. They carve out Middle East between the French and the English. The English take over Iraq and Palestine, and the French take over Syria, Lebanon, and those places. You know, they just got a ruler, and they just marked it. And that's what they do with India, Pakistan, and today's Bangladesh as well. Are we running out of time?
No. I just want to ask a question.
Let me just finish this. Sorry. And they take over. So from looking into history, so we have two real downfall moments in Islam. So the time of the Crusaders and Genghis Khan, very close, within 100 years. And from the First World War to the Second World War is our real downtime. And after the Second World War, believe it or not, my brothers, it may look like we've been downtrodden, but Muslims have been slowly rising. Muslims are rising because that's when most of the Muslim countries gained their independence. Like Algeria in 1962, India, Pakistan, 1947. Many other Muslim countries start to gain independence, and we're taking control of ourselves again. Like, you know, the mother countries are taking control of themselves again. So from the Second World War onwards, this really weakens the European powers. And this power shifts to America. So from a colonial power, you have a global power now. But this global power is actually more of a mind power than a real power. If that makes sense. It's more in everyone's mind that this is a real powerful country. It's not, because we saw what happened in Afghanistan in 20 years' time. We know what happened in Vietnam. They're not an actual real power. It's a power more in the head than anything else. And everyone fears this technology and superiority, but it's really not there. Muslims should rule again, you know, but we have to be conscious of it, and we have to constantly, you know, make effort on this. And our character should resemble this more than anything else. Inshallah. Your question, sorry.
So there's a film called Lawrence of Arabia.
Yeah.
Where does that tie in timeline?
Oh yeah, so this ties in very much that at the peak of colonial time. So you're talking about early 1900s, like mid 1900s. So this is when, in terms of power, you have the British Empire is absolute peak. What they used to say, the sun never sets, because Canada was part of the British Empire, and on the far east, Australia, New Zealand was part of the empire, and in the middle you had India, and India was the crown jewel. And Lawrence of Arabia, he's going in there to psych up the Arabs to rise against the Turks. So the way the British ruled was conquer, divide and conquer. So what they did is like, why are these Turks, non-Arabs, why are they the Khatib of Makkah, Medina, of the holiest place and Jerusalem, when it should be you Arabs? And they promise Hussein, Sharif of Makkah, to be the next Khalifa. But they backstab him and they give it to the Saud family instead. So Lawrence of Arabia, he's going there making all these alliances. But he was a little bit naive as well, from what I know. He didn't know that the Arabs were actually going to get backstabbed like the way they did. Because even the British, the ones that were behind, they didn't even reveal the secret plans to Lawrence of Arabia. So he wasn't even aware of the master plan. Because he actually really fell in with the love of Arab culture. He really embraced everything. And he was psyching up the Arabs with the best of intention, he could argue. But the guys over here had other plans. So this is around the 1920s peak. So I didn't mention about the Silk Letter conspiracy. This is when Hussein Ahmad Madani and Mahmud al-Hassan, they are arrested in Makkah because they had the Silk Letters they were going to take to the Ottomans, because they were going to make an alliance with the Ottomans. And for the first time, the Ottomans were going to send soldiers and army to invade British India, save it. And Gandhi as well was in favor of this, because Gandhi was pro-Khilafat as well. So the Khilafat was about to expand seriously, but the opposite happened because he got arrested. And yeah, it was just a very unfortunate time. And this is around, say, 1910s, I would say. Yeah, before the 90s. So 1990, just before the First World War breaking out. Yeah. Any more questions? Yeah, go for it.
I want to say, I don't think anyone else is going to ask, but I'll ask. So the rise and fall of an empire, you mentioned two reasons why they fall, isn't it? Is there any more reasons or causes where, like you said complacent, and we just get too comfortable, or we don't. We lose our purpose.
Yeah.
Is there any other causes where we can focus to rectify ourselves
Like
as well
this doesn't happen
in
as
this
yeah.
day and age? Yeah.
Yeah. So what happens? It's a rule of. It's a very very basic law. Rule. As the best way to understand this, if you read the works of Ibn Khaldun, the Muqaddimah, he explained this
it's
very
massive.
well. Yeah, but you can get small. It's about this big.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Translated by someone called Rosenthal. I think I pronounce his name, but it's called the Muqaddimah. You can get it in English. It's not that big and it's not that difficult to read. He explains it very well. Best way to understand this, if I put it in a cliche, is hard men, strong men, hard men make soft times. Soft times make soft men. Soft men make hard times.
Yeah.
You know,
and then there's a cycle.
And the cycle goes on. Now, one of the fascinating things is there's two dynasties you could say almost defy that. It's normally 4 to 6 generations it takes for a dynasty to rise and then it falls. And he uses, because Ibn Khaldun was amazing, he negotiated with the Christians who were invading Spain, taking Spain from the Muslims during the time of the Al-Muwahhidun or the Almohads. Also, he negotiated with the greatest ruler of his time, Emir Timur, when he comes to invade Egypt from the Mamluks. And the Mamluks were quite weak then. They were fellow Turks. But anyway, they send out Ibn Khaldun to negotiate. He negotiates and saves. So it's very, very intelligent. And he explains it, why this happens really. And it's quite logical. It's like the first people that come, they're very hard-ridden, hard, you know, so they're always out there. They don't get used to the comfort. Yeah. And the second, and there's his son will continue with this. And then the grandson gets a bit more comfortable, and the great-grandson is like, you know, he's having a good time in a palace. He's not even going out there. And then it takes another 4 generations to fall again. So normally it's about 4 to 6 generations. It's only the Uthmaniya Khilafah that lasts 600 years in the human history. No family ruled that long.
Yeah. Can you say even, so in this country I've noticed that, well, not the British government, I'm not sure about the British government. Yeah. They give us the education and everything, but they never teach us how to think.
Yeah.
Is that also a downfall of like independent thinking, or even to think for ourselves? But they've already taught us how to think.
Yeah, tell you how to think rather than letting you think. Yeah. So this is
that true? Would you say that?
Yeah, absolutely.
From history.
So when I said in the beginning, like the idea of Europe was established when the Christians take over Spain, yeah? So this is when this thing about this, we're a European, we're a people, this idea is established then. Now, why does Europe go into the Dark Ages? When Rome falls. Rome falls when Constantine the Great, when he adopts Christianity, and then he sets the Council of Time. I'll just finish this one quickly. He sets the Council of Nicaea, and Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, which logically can never make sense, right? Can make sense. He makes this the religion of the state. And what happens then, because the Greek philosophy is all about thinking, they ban thinking. You're not allowed to think anymore. So that's why Europe, or Western Europe especially, goes into decline, because they're not allowed to think. Because if you think, then you're going to ask questions, and the Trinity can never make sense. So you're not allowed to think. That's why Christian Europe never developed. Only time they develop is from when they take over from the Muslims and they learn from the Muslims.